Now coming to tonight's session, please allow me to welcome Rajeshwari, the host of this session. Rajeshwari is the R&D engineer manager at Bangalore. She is successfully leading and managing a highly talented team of engineers in building network solutions. She is brilliant at building teams from scratch and leading them to be productive in a short time. Rajeshwari's forte lies in software product development and delivery, software architecture, design and development, network security, virtualization, cloud computing, agile, and Scrum. She is an alumni at the Institute of Product Leadership pursuing the EMBA program in product leadership. Great to have you here with us, Raji. Handing the session over to you now.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Shama?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, can you see my video?
Yep, good to go.
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much for that brief introduction about me. And also thank you so much for giving me this opportunity for being the host for the day. Before I actually get to speak about the speakers, I would like to know a few things more about our audience for the day. So all that you need to do is please participate in a poll where you have to select one option among the list of choices. Yeah, I think Shama has launched a poll. So please go ahead and pull in your choices. So while the poll is on, are you an industry professional just like me who want to break into this digital product management? Or are you already a digital product manager who wants to sharpen your toolkit and then fast track your career growth? In either ways, this talk is for you. In the talk today, we are going to learn about 5 things or 5 ways to succeed as a digital product manager. Let me take this privilege to introduce Anu Ramakrishnan. Anu Ramakrishnan is the director of product at Applied Cognition. So Applied Cognition is a health tech company which focuses on solving some of the nation's most challenging consumer problems in healthcare. Through their solutions with software applications, IoTs, and connected devices. And prior to this, Anu was working in Zenintech and Samsung Health. Apart from this, Anu is also was a featured speaker and instructor at product school. And outside work, I would say she's like super duper talented woman. I mean, multi-talented, like you just name it, she's into it. She's like an occasional singer. She's also an artist, or probably she might even end our day with, instead of a thank you slide, she might even hum a song for us. So, and she also loves to give, talks on product management, digital health, and crafted artwork. And she keeps up with all the latest trends in fashion. And trust me, she also does fashion talks. I don't know where she gets so much time. And, to unleash this magic of such a successful person, I asked Anu 3 questions. Like, what is that, Anu, what is it she loves about her profession? For which Anu says, no 2 days are same. And she gets to face tons of challenges at her work. And also she loves the fact that she gets to meet incredible people at her work in this journey. And second thing that I asked Anu, where there are few tips for me, for my transitioning product manager, and for the listeners out there, I asked her, what are those few key habits which transformed her in her career? For which Anu says, question everything, like absolutely question everything. And she told a lot of beautiful statements, like, where I was like, so damn resonated. She told, don't be obsessed about perfection. It's okay not to be like perfect in everything. And she says, never give up. And one more beautiful thing that Anu mentioned is, building relations along with products. Like, how beautiful is this? Like, I have read Anu's posts on the patient success stories. She's been a person who's been building products, always keeping consumers in her mind. And who else can be better at this talk for the day? And also I asked her, what is her day in life of Anu? What does she do? So Anu says, in this work from home life, she spends some of her time at office meetings. And she also works on documentation, working on strategy. And she also tells that she reads every single day to catch up with the latest trends in the industry. I mean, I have so much to tell about her. Her posts, her articles are like truly amazing and inspiring. But then let me not take more of time so that we get maximum from Anu for the day. So here I welcome Anu Ramakrishnan, the speaker of the day. Hi, Anu.
Hey Raji, and hey everyone at IPL. Thank you so much for having me here today. And also thank you so much for that amazing introduction. I think that was way more credit than I deserve, but really appreciate you introducing me for this talk. With that, I'd love to sort of share my screen and get into the presentation for the day. Just a few things here. I just want to make sure that you guys can see my screen. I'm going to go here into presentation mode. So you guys can see and hear me, right? And see my screen as well.
Yes, Anu, very much. We can see it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. As Raji mentioned, I'm basically very excited to be here. And, I've had a lot of experience sort of building my career in digital product management, specifically focused on healthcare and health tech. But I'm here to kind of share my learnings, 5, core skills and 5 core ways that you can succeed as a PM. And really when I was, coming up with this talk, I was reflecting back on my own career and kind of, reminiscing some of the great lessons that I've learned, some of them, the hard way, but nevertheless, I'm really happy to share these findings with you and, keep in mind that I also saw from the poll that, there are people from various, levels of experience here. So there are, folks who are like early into product management, just transitioning to digital product management. And then we also have a lot of seasoned PMs here as well. So hopefully this talk has something for everyone. I'm really hoping that I can make the most use of your time. And I know that I'm probably the one thing between you and your weekend plan. So I'll keep it succinct. All right, so getting into the agenda for today. So I want to kind of start off by giving you guys an introduction to myself and my journey into product. It's always a good thing to level set and give you guys a sort of a ride along into the history of how I got to where I am today. And then I'll jump into kind of the meat of today's talk, which is kind of talking through the 5 core digital PM skills. When I think of like 5 ways to succeed, I think the way I kind of interpret that is to focus on the core skill sets that every PM needs to have to really succeed in building good products, and also, kind of taking and level setting their career and sort of fast tracking growth, right? So we'll get into that. And then we'll also kind of end with a case study from a real life example of a product challenge that I had to solve and how I could essentially put all of these 5 principles into action. And the case study is kind of focused on a health tech app. So, I'll get into sort of the weeds of that in a bit, but just wanted to kind of give you guys a context on the agenda for today before I dive in. All right, so starting off, I wanted to share a little bit about myself and my journey. So I came to the US in 2009 from India, and I got my undergraduate degree in biomedical engineering from University of Washington. And, I was always interested in going into medicine and, becoming an MD and, all of that, but just, foresighting into how many years of time I'd be in college and how far it'll be for me to actually start making a real paycheck. I was like, I'm going to find the next best option to still stay in healthcare, but then maybe not be an MD. And so bioengineering was, the perfect fit for me. And so, I started my undergraduate career, and then 3 years in, I kind of realized, okay, yeah, this is great. And, I think engineering is fantastic, but I really want to be kind of in the interface of engineering and business and not just kind of be behind the scenes. And so I started exploring options into MBAs and, management degrees. And I decided that engineering management was a great master's program for me to pursue. And so I went over to Dartmouth to get my master's in engineering management. And really that opened up a lot of opportunities for me career-wise, because I now had, that foundational technical degree and, the domain knowledge. And at the same time, I also had exposure to a lot of core business skills to really get my foot in the door into the world of tech. So I kickstarted my career at a company called iRhythm, which at the time was an early stage, or not early stage, I would say mid-stage startup. about 200 people. They had already established product market fit. They were developing wearable ECG monitors. So these were prescription medical devices that could be prescribed to patients who are at risk for stroke or arrhythmia. And they would essentially wear this patch for 14 days, and then they would send it back to iRhythm. They would do data processing and ultimately prepare an end of wear report for the physician. So I came in sort of, at an entry level role where I was sort of the jack of all trades. The way I like to describe it is they literally put me into any task that didn't have anyone else hired to do. So it was in a way a blessing and an opportunity, right? Because I had a great opportunity to learn the weeds of so many different functions in an organization, right from analytics to project management, to operations, to strategy. And really, I think one of the most exciting stints in my career there was the opportunity that I had to launch the first patient app that iRhythm had launched for symptom tracking and symptom management. And that was really my first tryst into digital product management, and really kind of opened up the doors of opportunity that I would have in the future going into the space. So it was an excellent opportunity, right from understanding our users, understanding needs, translating something that was previously done in pen and paper, literally. So, patients would be given a symptom booklet, and they would actually write down their symptoms and send back to iRhythm for data processing. And it totally made sense for us to launch an app for them to do this electronically. And so it was a fantastic opportunity for me to really own the end-to-end of product development, and take something that didn't exist and build something from 0 to 1. And, I absolutely enjoyed working on that app and, getting it through launch, and then also getting it through growth stage. And through that process, I learned a lot about product management, and also was able to define a product management function within my organization, because that actually did not exist when I transitioned. And, the engineering was doing a lot of product development then. So I had a unique opportunity to create a path for product development, digital product development at iRhythm. And so, that was a great learning opportunity. And I think I had kind of reached a point where I was 4 years into that job, and I was ready for a change. I think I had maxed out learning opportunities there. And I wanted to sort of see what it would be like to work at bigger companies, right? So that's when I transitioned over to Samsung Health. And, there I had a great opportunity to work across B2B as well as B2C products in healthcare, primarily revolving around the Galaxy smartwatch. So very exciting to learn about consumer wearables, deep diving into taking a very user-centered approach to developing products. I got to work with a world-class design team there. And, I think I learned a lot of my playbooks of product management from Samsung, which was great. And then I went over to Genentech, which is actually one of the largest biotech companies in the US. And I got to essentially lead their digital product management wing for oncology. And so that was another exciting challenge, bringing digital product development and digital product management to a very sort of historical company where, things are very much done in a waterfall style. And so that was an interesting challenge in itself. So at the end of that, I think it's safe to say that I had really kind of established domain expertise in healthcare and health tech, and in product development, specifically for healthcare. And, I think I always made a conscious decision in my career to sort of stick to my roots, which was healthcare, and stick to my passion, and really kind of develop depth in that. And so, my one piece of advice at this stage from my own career learnings is, I think if you're looking to grow, and if you're looking to sort of, sort of fast track your career growth, I think trying to stick to your passion and trying to stick to your domain is probably a good thing, as opposed to trying to do too many different things at every given point. So anyway, today I'm here at a company called Applied Cognition. We are a early stage health tech venture, and we're focused on developing health tech and wearables for neurocognitive decline. So you think about anything from Alzheimer's to Parkinson's disease, and basically developing wearables to track and monitor biomarkers. And have a unique opportunity here again to be a lead of a product management team. So hiring PMs, designers, really building our product from scratch. And so, I think it's an exciting opportunity for me. All right, so enough about me. Let's kind of get into the meat of today's talk. So what, according to me, are the 5 core skills for a digital product manager to be successful, right? So the way I've kind of laid this out is I have, in each of the slides, you'll see that I have the skills laid out, and then I have specific examples or, examples and sort of constraints to illustrate those skills. And then finally, I think you'll see it all come together in the case study. So to start off, the first core skill that I would love to talk about is prioritization and being able to cut through noise. And I think it's safe to say that every successful manager, product manager, is someone who can ruthlessly prioritize, right? So at any given point, product managers are ones who are actually closest to the business, to the customers, and to the KPIs and OKRs, right? So at any given point, you are the person in charge of making decisions for your team, helping unblock them, and make them realize kind of what's the most important thing for us to build now versus later. So, some examples of where this prioritization thinking comes to help, and also some examples of where this can be put to action. So, I think first and foremost, in order to prioritize well, I think PMs need to have a lot of alignment with the company's North Star metrics. So, at any given, I think different companies do it differently, where there are metrics like top line metrics, and then there are like specific metrics that come into like every feature or every release. So it's really important for you to be cognizant of what those North Star metrics are, so that every time you're making a decision or pushing back to engineering or to customers, you know that you can always tie back to those North Star metrics when you make a decision. Another great example where prioritization is really helpful is when you're thinking about making decisions to prioritize new features versus tech debt, right? And this is something that's very applicable for growth stage companies, especially where maybe initially, even the first couple of years, you sort of made certain your team made technical decisions to just get the product out the door. But now you have scaling challenges because you have, many, many thousands of users using your product, and certain things don't scale as well. So how do you make a decision as a product manager to determine if you should keep building new things, or if you should, allocate some resources and some time for addressing tech debt, right? So the ways to think about that are, what parts of the tech debt apply to what features, and how those features ultimately affect your customers and your North Star metrics. And that, sort of way of thinking can help you sort of decide how much allocation to make for tech debt versus like how much to keep building new features and chugging along, right? And then lastly, I want to talk about ad hoc customer requests. And this is especially relevant for enterprise products and B2B2C territory, where, at any given point, you might have your sprint scope laid out and everything planned to the T. And then lo and behold, you have a customer telling you that, hey, I need this new feature in the next 2 months, else I'm moving out, or I'm going to find another vendor to work with, right? Or you have competition, which is catching up, and essentially they're launching new features, and they're essentially developing their roadmap much more quickly than you are. So I think these are all great examples of where you have ad hoc things to essentially prioritize, where how do you decide if you should continue building what you had originally scoped, or come back and prioritize some of these requests that come in ad hoc. So I think these are some great, and I'm sure there are many others, and I think prioritization applies to a lot of day-to-day decisions for PMs, but these are some of the top ones that come to mind. All right, so the next core skill, according to me at least, is how to manage trade-offs. And in my opinion, I think every step of the way, PMs are constantly weighing out costs, benefits, and risks of making decisions, whether they're strategic decisions or tactical and executionary decisions, right? And at every step of the way, you're trying to understand customer impact, the risk that this decision can bring to the business, and also the cost and the the energy and resources that it's going to take to get it done. So certain examples of this specific concept here is I like to use the example of UX, right? So oftentimes when I'm with my design team and we're brainstorming the best way to develop or design a feature, you always have the ideal, and then you have kind of what's feasible, right? So your UX team might tell you that, okay, this is the best experience that we can provide for our users, and then your engineering team is going to come back and say, oh, no, but that's going to take us 9 months to build. But we can do this other thing that may not be super ideal, but then it's something that we can get out the door in 3 months, right? So as a PM, you're trying to make trade-offs as to realize, okay, do I really want that ideal experience? And is that what's going to boost our metrics and give us what we need? Or can I make do with this, not so ideal experience, but is also feasible, and, get this out the door so we can start getting some early feedback quickly, right? So that's, I think, in my opinion, sort of the best minimum viable approach that you can take. And of course, sometimes the 3 months worth of feature is not good enough, and it might do more damage than good. So it's always like making that trade-off decision to determine how much risk this is going to introduce, and what's the best way forward. And then speaking of risk, I think it's really important to understand your company and your team's risk tolerance, right? So I can say from a couple of experiences that I've had. So healthcare, obviously, like, in the healthcare industry, your tolerance to risk is really, really low. Like, one risky change can potentially cause harm to life because you're dealing with patients and you're dealing with technology that patients use to potentially sustain life. So generally with healthcare products, risk is always, the tolerance to risk is always very low. And similarly, I also think that at larger companies, risk tolerance tends to be low as well, because, they have a certain brand reputation, they have certain metrics that they need to report on, and, they're a publicly traded company in most cases. So, I think risks, company risks can also differ a lot depending on the size of the company and the sort of stage that they are in. So it's really important to understand all of these things before you go into decision-making and you sort of trickle that decision-making process all the way down to your day-to-day features. All right, the third thing I want to talk about here is how to create two-way doors. And I think one of the great things about working in software and working with digital products is that software has the ability to be quickly iterated upon as opposed to hardware, right? Where, if you need to make a hardware change, like it's likely going to take you at least 6 months to a year to make that happen. Whereas with software, you can potentially get those changes in minutes, right? If you wanted to. So I think that's one of the great advantages to developing software products. And I think as PMs, you always want to make sure you're thinking about two-way doors in the sense of backwards compatibility and giving your users a way out every time you launch features, right? And how do you kind of think about iterative product development as opposed to doing everything in one go and then not having a way to roll things back? So some examples of this is, I think A/B testing is a great way to create two-way doors early on, because A/B testing allows you to introduce a concept to maybe a portion of your users and then basically get some early feedback before you decide to roll out the change to everyone, right? And similarly, backwards compatibility, like every time you're doing A/B testing or you're launching new releases, maybe you're doing a beta version and you're launching into like maybe 10% of your user base. How do you ensure that that version is backwards compatible across other software versions and also across other devices, right? So for example, if you're developing apps and you're constantly updating your support matrix, how do you make sure that if you are launching a new version, it's compatible with iOS versions that are like, before 14, for example? And so, that's another sort of important constraint to think about while creating two-way doors. And of course, thinking about your rollback strategy. So going back to that risk tolerance, right? So what are some of the 30-day metrics that you're looking to track to see if, this feature was successful versus like if you should roll it back and, do another iteration before you launch again. And then also thinking about app updates, right? So one thing for sure in the enterprise world is that, so app updates are not as frequent sometimes and are also not as user-friendly as, for example, consumer apps, where, you could update apps as you go, but, your users may not update their versions, but it might still be okay for them to be on an older version. But sometimes that doesn't work for like healthcare apps, where you need to have people upgrade because maybe that there's a bug in there that's really risky for them to continue using the product with, right? So thinking about your app update strategy is also really important as part of release planning. All right, the next one here is something that I really like to talk about, which is, ask for the problem and not the solution, right? And this is also something that's very pertinent to enterprise products where, I cannot tell you the number of times I've had customers come to me or account managers come to me and say, oh, Anu, I need your team to build me this, this pop-up on this portal because that's what our customers want to see, right? And I can definitely say there have been days in my early career days where I've literally like nodded my head and gone ahead and built that only to realize that that was the worst thing to do, right? So I've learned through hard experiences that you always need to make sure you get to the bottom of the problem. So if a customer or an account manager tells you that, hey, this is what I want, try and ask why and try and get into the depth of what their core problem is that they're trying to solve, right? So maybe it is that their users are frustrated at on a certain feature, or maybe they're having certain barriers to essentially completing a certain task, right? So there are many ways in which you can essentially get down to the bottom of a problem. So one strategy that I love to follow is shadowing and doing ethnography research, right? So a lot of times in the past, I've been able to fly down to sites where we're actually launching products and literally like be a fly on the wall and see how customers are using the product. And that's the best way to kind of realize in real time kind of where their friction points are, where their pain points are, and where there are really opportunities to optimize, right? Ethnography research is very similar too, where when you're designing user-centered apps, you basically like try and have your test users do something like journaling or taking photographs of what they're doing with their day-to-day. And essentially you compare kind of what they say versus what they're actually doing. And there's oftentimes a huge gap between what users say they do and what they actually do, right? So that's a really important sort of consideration to have while trying to get to the bottom of the problem. UX testing obviously is another really important consideration. So at any given opportunity, especially with software products, right, you can create a concept, you can take it to users, get early feedback, and then bring it back into your design sprints and iterate upon it before you actually get into coding and developing those features, right? So that's another way in which you can get an opportunity to test things early with customers. Like in my experience, I've taken early stage concepts where maybe it's just even a drawing or like a sort of an acceptable wireframe of a feature. And we literally take that to customers and say, hey, what are your thoughts? And do you think something like this would work for your for this workflow, for example, right? And get some early feedback before you actually launch a feature and wait for negative feedback to come your way. And then lastly, how can you help customers rationalize with data, right? So something to think about here is, you've done all this research, you've done shadowing, ethnography, user testing, and you've essentially accumulated all this data to push back to the customer and say, hey, this is why I think that pop-up is not what we should build, but here's another solution that I think is what will address your problem. How do you essentially present that in a way in which customers rationalize with you and also have conviction that, yes, I believe that this is the best solution for my problem, right? And then I think they almost become your partners in sort of the product development process. So I think in addition to finding the right ways or the best ways to gather data, it's also really important to figure out how to present that data in a way that's rationalizable for your customers. And then lastly, I want to talk about building relationships, right? And why it's important to do this and why it's important to be transparent with your team. So when I think about product management, I not just think about building great products, but I also think about building great teams and building great relationships. And ultimately, I think it's those great relationships that's going to make great products, right? So if you always think back to like experiences where you've launched products that were successful, the chances are you probably had a really good relationship with your design team and your engineering team and other stakeholders in the company. And so some of the ways in which I always try to sort of build relationships is first and foremost to empathize with your stakeholders, right? I think every stakeholder is trying to have their own set of metrics that they want to accomplish and their own OKRs. And it's really important that all of us kind of essentially negotiate the best way forward. And I always make sure that, especially in the healthcare setting, you have regulatory teams, you have legal teams who are very sort of conservative in their thinking, right? And so how do you sort of, literally get into their shoes, but at the same time, help explain things to them and contextualize things to them so that ultimately you can, make sure that you're building the best product for your users. And then defining communication protocols. As I mentioned, like I'm now leading a team and I have product managers and designers report to me. It's really important to make sure that you define communication protocols that allow for your team to escalate the right things and also be independent and sort of, be able to independently make decisions, right? Because at the end of the day, product management is a very independently led role where if you don't have that sort of freedom of decision making, you cannot do your job really well. So one of the things that one of the matrices here that I really like to just talk about, and I want to give credit to this great product manager expert called Shreyas Doshi, and you can find him on Twitter, and his readings are amazing. But basically, here's an excellent matrix that he essentially had proposed, where the way to kind of think about communication channels and escalation is to evaluate that across two metrics, right? So one is looking at the decision's impact to the business. So how impactful is this decision going to be for our business and our OKRs, right? So if, obviously, if the impact is high, you want to make sure that as a PM lead, you are consulting, you're having your team discuss and consult these decisions before they, sign off on them. And then also the other metric to think about is the confidence that this product manager has in the decision. So they might be situations where the impact to business might be low, but then the PM doesn't have a lot of confidence in their data or in their decision making, right? So maybe because they haven't done enough user research, or they were not able to get the data that they need, or the feedback was really mixed, right? So at that point, like there's a lot of intuition or potential gut feeling that needs to go into making that decision. And so I think that requires a lot of discussion and consultation. However, if it's, if the PM's confidence is high in that specific feature or that specific strategy, and the impact to business is also relatively low, I think, that the team should have the independence to sort of independently execute on those decisions without needing to escalate everything. So the goal of this matrix really is to help teams, make sure that there's transparency within the team on certain decisions, but at the same time, there's also the right escalation channels that are created so that there's not much noise and there's not much redundancy in the process. All right, so let's dive into the case study. I think this will take about 10 minutes for me to go through, but at the end of it, I would love to open it up for questions. I also see that there are a few hand raises, so I want to make sure that I get to everyone's question. All right, so this case study here relates to the symptom tracker app that I was talking about that I had launched, back in the day for iRhythm. And so this was a new app, as I mentioned. So we were building this from scratch, and this was in an adoption stage where, this was 60 days post-launch, right? So one of the things we noticed as far as usage metrics go was that there was a 23% drop off at sign up. So basically, we were seeing from the metrics that people would download the app, they would enter their prescription code, but they would not go as far as actually getting to the sign up page. And what we then learned from drill down analytics is that a lot of people were getting errors when they entered their prescription code, and because of which they were not able to move forward. So what were these errors, and what was the problem really here? And how might we as a product team discover the problem, understand where the constraints are, strategize on like what next steps should be, and then execute the right solution for this problem, right? So that's kind of going to be how I explain this case study to you all. So I want to give you some more context on the problem here. So this is a healthcare app, right? So, and this is also a B2B2C app where the way that the patients even get to know about this app is because they go to the doctor, they get a prescription for the wearable that they have to wear. And then the doctor tells them that, hey, there's also this app that you can download and use to track your symptoms on the go. However, the way we had designed the original onboarding experience was that the doctor actually had to go into this admin portal and had to create an enrollment for this user in order for the patient to now then be able to be successfully able to download and sign into the app. Now, as you can imagine, this was definitely a challenge. And the reason why we were seeing that 21% drop-off rate was because we saw that a ton of doctors were actually forgetting or missing to do the enrollments on the portal. So this is where I think, I think I want to illustrate this case study to sort of cover kind of how all these different core DPM skills can be put into action and how they were helpful for me in sort of structuring my process of thinking and how I essentially go about executing on a solution for this problem, right? So to get into the weeds of it, so first and foremost, trying to identify what the problem is, right? So we know that there was a 23% drop off, but why was that happening? And how likely was that? And how frequently was this happening? And what really causes the situation to occur? Because yes, we understand that it was the lack of enrollments that was causing the registration problem, but why were there so few enrollments, or why was there so much churn in the enrollment process? So this is where going back to some of the concepts I discussed earlier, right? So as part of problem identification, one of the things that we did was we literally had our user research team go down to a few of our top sites or most busiest sites and essentially, shadow the doctors and see what's going on. And so we basically learned that all these doctors were prescribing patches. So they would see patients, they would patch the device on the patient, they would tell them to download the app, and then the patient would essentially go home and literally like get excited about the app and download it. and then they would tap in their prescription code, and then they would get a message that says there's no enrollment. And what we noticed on the doctor's side was that the doctors were super busy, and they were patching like several dozen patients every day. And so what they would actually do is they would wait until the end of the day, or maybe even at the end of like 3 to 4 days, to start doing these enrollments in bulk. So what would end up happening is that the patients are already like with the patch, there've been several days that have gone by without a prescription and an enrollment, and they're trying to get into the app and they're not able to do that, right? So that was the reality. And so what we learned was that, yes, admins and doctors were generally really busy, and so they were not able to enroll patients at the rate at which we had originally thought that they would. The next thing is trying to do analyze trade-offs. So why did we design this feature in a specific way, in the first place, right? So was it intentional? Were there any specific constraints that we wanted to address, or were there any specific regulatory risks that were informing this design choice? So trying to understand and going back to revisit some of the original choices and trying to understand where the barriers and constraints were, and if those barriers and constraints still apply, and if they can really be broken, and sort of, we can get a little bit more creative on how we approach the problem, right? So that leads us into prioritization. So now that we understand there are many different ways in which we can solve the problem, right? So we get our design team, we get our engineers on board, we contextualize everyone, we be super transparent about the problem, and we all, get all hands on deck to identify how do we solve this problem. And I'm sure there are a multitude of solutions that we came up with. And ultimately, what is the MVP? So what should we do to address this problem in the fastest way for the lowest cost, but with the highest return? And so that's kind of the strategy we took to determine what the MVP approach would be. And then also trying to understand what are the different system components that need to change. So is this just an improvement that we need to make on the app? So is it as simple as saying anyone without a prescription can get into the app? Is that sort of the solution? Or are there any risks to making that so open, right? So how do we address this from not just an app point of view, but also from a service point of view? So is there something customer service can do to address the root of the problem, which is that doctors were just not having enough time to go in and do these enrollments in a fast manner? So basically trying to think outside the box and not just be constrained about that app that you're developing, and looking at all the different components at play that make this product successful. The next thing is creating two-way doors. So once we decided on a feature, once we decided that, okay, this was the way forward, and I'll get into the solution in the next slide, but once we decided that that was the way forward, how do we determine if this, for example, if we launched this feature and it still didn't make any movement to our drop-off metrics, was this change reversible? Could we iterate upon this change where we learn things and then we, add more features or add more changes and essentially iterate upon what we had originally launched? And ultimately, it says whatever change we're going to make, is that reversible? Because at the end of the day, we don't want to cause more damage than good, right? And then lastly, of course, transparency and communications, right? So once we landed on what we're going to build, how we're going to build it, and what the timelines are, and what the release process is going to be, it was important for us to go to executives to get buy-in on this project or this feature, and then also be able to communicate and rally our teams, which is UX, development, and other stakeholders to get behind us. And something also to call out here was, because this is a healthcare app and there's a high level of risk involved, we also had to make sure our regulatory and legal teams were on board with this change, because if we're going to allow patients into this app without a prescription, there's a lot of risk with holding their sensitive health data without actually knowing if these patients truly have a prescription from the doctor or not. And so there's a lot of risk with holding sensitive medical data without having a prescription or a doctor's note to basically fall back on. So that was another important stakeholder for us to vet this feature and this change out with before we decided to go into any action. All right, so diving into what we did for the feature here, and without getting into too many details, one of the first things we did was we went into the app and we said, okay, let's just remove the constraint of requiring this prescription to get in. So let's remove this validation rule. Let's have users, let's give users the ability to get into the app whenever they want it. And then let's resolve all the discrepancies around the prescription in the back, right, in the back end, right? So the way we had to do that in the back end was we said, okay, we already have Salesforce as our CRM management tool. So now let's think about how we can leverage Salesforce as an internal tool to build a robust ticketing system so that we can handle any sort of reconciliation requests in a very graceful manner, and be able to close the loop back with the doctor. Because ultimately the problem we're trying to solve is we don't want to get too many unprescribed patients in the app without actually having a prescription at the end of the day. So what we did was, every time we detected that a patient was getting into the app without a prescription, that would flag a corresponding Z ticket on Salesforce that the customer service member could then look at and realize that, oh yeah, we have some patients who are using our app without actually having a prescription. And now they could call the relevant medical assistant or the doctor to say, hey, it's been 3 days that you've patched this patient and they still haven't received a prescription. Could you go ahead and close the loop? And basically what we did here is we solved the problem on the app. We made sure from the user experience point of view, it's a seamless process and they have nothing to worry about as far as patients go. And as far as the doctors go, they were getting the reminders that they needed to actually go ahead and complete the enrollment. So from a cost, risk, and benefit perspective, this was the most optimal feature for us to implement. And we also noticed that, within 30 days of launch, we saw a 14% reduction in drop-off rates. Because obviously more people were able to get in without any constraints, and we were also able to resolve these open tickets in a much more efficient manner. And so net, I'm hoping that this a case study was a way for me to demonstrate these 5 core principles in action, and hopefully you took away something from my experience working on this case. All right, so with that, I want to end my conversation for today. I want to open it up for questions. Absolutely feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or feel free to check out my portfolio as well. I'd be happy to connect with you folks. Anyone who's interested in transitioning to digital product management, or who's already a digital product manager looking to scale and grow, very happy to mentor and discuss your journey with me. So yeah, feel free to connect. And with that, I will open it up for Q&A.
Thank you, Anu, for the brilliant and engaging session. The keynote was captivating with really relevant and useful insights. So Raji, can we go ahead with the Q&A session now?
Yeah, sure. That was such an amazing session by you, Anu, and it's a new way of learning where you presented a case study and helped us to go through your journey. Such a different way of approaching a problem.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad that you found it useful.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have like so many questions, but then due to the time, we'll just pick a few of the relevant ones. So you can also look in, Anu, if you
Yeah, I just saw one here from Manoj. So there's a question on the case study. So what if, the question is, what if an unregistered or say irrelevant customer signs up on the app? Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And actually that's something that we had definitely considered as part of the experience, right? So we deliberately decided to allow unregistered users, and we decided that we will internally do the heavy lifting of figuring out if this was an unregistered user or not. The one good thing is we had a way to weed out like people who absolutely had no connection. So like the last thing we wanted is for random people to go to the app store and download the app and try to get in and then leave a bad review to say, oh, I could not get into the app, right? So we had something called a registration code that we was basically the device ID. So once the patient got a device, they would need that device ID to actually get into the first step of the app. So that guardrail was still there. So we wouldn't allow people to just randomly like put a username, password, and sign in until they had that device code to put in into the app. But after that stage was where the constraint was, right? So once they put in the device ID, they needed to make sure that there was an enrollment, so a registration on the system, and then also that their date of birth and all these other things matched. So we removed all those restrictions. And so the way we consolidated that in the CRM platform is we said, let's identify cases where there was no enrollment and also cases where the data was mismatching. And so that way customer service had the right tools to escalate these questions with the doctors and close the loop with them. Hopefully that answered your question. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Raji.
Like from Deepak, how do you empathize with the users, especially in the case of cognitive impairments? Like curious to know, like what process you
that's
follow.
a great one. Yeah, so I think when we think about cognitive impairment and dementia and neurodegeneration, we're automatically thinking about patients who are generally older, so people who are over 60 years of age, and who are generally not as tech savvy as millennials or Gen Z, and who are not as familiar with using, technology apps and connected devices and things like that. So the first level of empathy is that, right? So understanding that you're working with a customer base who is not as familiar with, design patterns and app patterns that you would otherwise find in an app like Instagram, for example, right? So that's the first level of empathizing. And the second level of empathizing is in a more clinical perspective, right? So understanding that while this person might be at risk for dementia because maybe they have a genetic marker or maybe they have risk factors, family history, they're also currently going through other things, right? So they might be a patient who is at risk for dementia, but is also currently having high blood pressure or has a physical ailment that prevents them from walking or is colorblind. And so they, maybe don't have as great an experience using a mobile app, right? So that's the second level of empathy that you develop for those users. And then I think a third thing would be sort of to figure out what is the most valuable solution that you can create for them, which gives them a sense of ownership and gives them a sense of meaning to say that, okay, yeah, I'm convinced that using this app or using this watch or this wearable is going to help me improve my health condition and is going to help me empower my own self, right? So that's, I think, the North Star of the experience that we try to create for our users. And so, yeah, I think these three are definitely top of mind when it comes to developing user empathy for older patients and also for people in this disease demographic.
And one more interesting question, Nanu. Rohit asks, shadowing and doing ethnographic research, as you mentioned, right? Like generative research, what you do. So it's quite expensive. Like, how does a product manager decide how many resources to spend on this? How many people to shadow and how long? Like, what is the time frame that you use to get to the maximum role? So,
yeah, absolutely. And I think despite working in big companies, I can definitely say that at big companies and small companies alike, you always have to make a case to spend money on user research. So the way I typically do that is, so one thing is trying to make a case for the research itself, right? So how do you go to a CEO or a VP and say that, hey, yeah, this, I need X amount of dollars to do this research, and this is the consequence of not doing the research, right? That's always a good place to start. So help them understand, if we do nothing, here are the risks, and here are the risks and the sort of constraints of designing this feature without that data. And literally have a conversation with the executive team to understand, is this a risk that we're willing to take? Can we go to market without having any data of how a user might interface with this product or what the real problem is, right? Or, going back to that example of like, we, that one situation where we actually went ahead and built what the customer asked us to do, that had several horrible ripple effects on our product and our sort of brand as well, right? Because we built this feature for them, and then we learned quickly that that was not what they wanted, and that feature didn't perform well. So all these data points is going to help you make a good case to your executive team to say, this is why I don't want these mistakes to happen again, and this is why you need to allocate X amount of dollars to do this research. That's step number one. Step number two is the question around how many users is good enough. In my experience, I've seen that typically 5 to 10 is a good amount, after which point your feedback starts to plateau. I think in my experience, with 5 to 6 users, you start to see a diverse range of problems. And then from the 5 to 10 set, you'll start to see kind of which problems are more frequent and which problems are more likely to happen. But I think that's the beauty of user research. Like, I think there's always this misconception that you need thousands of users or thousands of data for you to actually make a decision. And that's often not the case. And especially with things like formative research and ethnography, I think there's a lot of, like, for example, if I'm going to shadow doctors, chances are, even if there are 20 doctors in that hospital, all 20 of them are going to have a very similar day-to-day workflow, right? They're all going to be seeing patients in a very similar way. They're all going to be using the same tools, having the same problems. So you'll start to see that sort of happen and that theme sort of emerge. And so, yeah, I think, you can definitely get a lot done with 5 users. And my argument also is that I would rather test with 1 user than test with no one. So I think that's another way to position it.
So what you say is you see a pattern and that's enough. I mean, that's how you conclude on what people want.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So there's one more question that I would like to ask related to communication metrics. Like, how do you make your PMs aware about the impact on business? like on the North Star metrics that you mentioned, or what exactly you want to achieve? Like, how do you make your PMs aware? And because it happens especially with fresh PMs, that they are unable to judge about the impact and they are confident in their data or decision. They're not that confident,
Right.
I think.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and something that I think is a process that I'm also learning every day. So I think first and foremost, going back to that transparency, right? So how do you create transparency the moment you have knowledge about something? So, for example, in my experience, every time the CEO or the VP sets a certain OKR for the year, and defines kind of what our objectives are and how they kind of relate to the company mission and how they relate to our business objectives, whether it's increasing revenue or profit margins or whatever that is. How do you make sure? So once you kind of are at that stage where you've kind of aligned your roadmap to that, giving your team all the data points that you can provide them to sort of literally like give them the sense of ownership and give them the sense of transparency that, hey, this is essentially literally from the executive team's mouth, and like this is what we need to focus on. I think bringing, and if possible, like bringing them along for the right discussions. I think for me, I found that great managers are the ones who actually bring their team along, versus those that just sit in a silo and try to like just get their relationship strengthened, and then they don't really pass on that sort of transparency down the team. So I think that's step number one. Step number two is really knowing when to hold hands and when to allow the team to be independent, right? So I can say for myself that, I think based on, I have multiple PMs in the past, and like you definitely learn that some PMs are way more comfortable and way more experienced and way more natural at their job, right? They know they have a good sense of intuition. They understand your customers really well. They understand your business objectives really well. And so you learn from like maybe a couple of releases, like which PMs are the ones that are independently able to execute and which ones kind of need that help. And even more specifically, I think some PMs are very strong, like tactically and execution focused. Like they're really good about finding the best way to launch the MVP and removing all the constraints that you need to make this feature successful. Whereas some, and they're like great operators, right? And some PMs are like not great operators, but they're very great at strategic thinking, right? So, being able to manage trade-offs and figuring out like how to do user research in a compelling way. So I think trying to understand where your team's strengths are and supporting them in areas where they're, a little bit weaker, or they might potentially be, it might be helpful to have a little bit of additional support. So I think it's a little bit of a trial and error, but I would say, yeah, it takes maybe 2 releases to understand that.
Okay. So there's one more question, Anu. Are there any suggestions regarding how to appropriately prioritize and balance enhancements and new feature requests from customers when there's also a significant amount of regulation and contractual obligations that carry heavy weight and always end up rising the top of the backlog with hard deadlines?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's definitely a lot of questions packaged there. Yeah, I think one general framework for prioritization is to understand a few things. So one is understanding impact to business, and then understanding impact to customer, and then looking at the cost, right? So at bare minimum, I think if you do these 3 things, you will already get a roster of, kind of what features bubble up to the top versus which ones can potentially get deprioritized. So I think that's always an excellent way. And I think, in my opinion, the way I, in the past, the way I have kind of done that in practice is typically, hopefully you've done enough user research, or, you've done enough analytics to understand the impact of the customer and impact to business. And then, you develop your roadmap based on that. And then all you need to do is work with your engineering and design teams to understand sizing, right? So we do something called a t-shirt sizing early on to determine kind of, which features are going to be excels and, largest. Right. And is there really value in like doing those features in this time frame, right? Or is there a way to break it down and maybe do part of it now and then part of it can come later? So that's, I think, one strategy that's been helpful for prioritization. Now, in terms of managing risks across like regulatory and constraints around regulatory and legal, I kind of take it case by case. And typically when I'm road mapping something, and even literally, I think last week when I was creating this roadmap, I did this, where you literally add a column and you say, okay, I want to understand dependencies, right? And certain features are going to be heavily dependent on regulatory giving you the sign off, or legal teams reviewing the feature and reviewing the spec and saying, okay, yeah, these are legally okay and these are not. So I always define that up front, because I would hate for us to not understand those constraints, design something, and then learn that that has to be redone from scratch. So I think understanding those constraints up front, and if whenever you're in doubt, I think one of the good things about, or one of the good skills to have as a product manager, is to ask the right questions, right? So if you are in doubt, and if you think that, I'm a little bit skeptical about this feature and us having a lot of independence here, take it to your team and try to get them to, provide feedback early on. So yeah, hopefully, all of these ways can help do better at prioritization.
Right.
Do we want to take one more question?
Yeah, just one last probably. Okay, there's one from, okay, Adesh. What is the process to monetize an app and get good number of sign-up for an app in case if the app belongs to rating agency here? So rating agency app refers to an app where individual user can rate their celebrity on the basis of their work and popularity.
Interesting. I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer this because I haven't worked on like B2C apps, but monetization, I think, really depends on the industry and the domain you're in. I can definitely say that at least in US for healthcare apps, a lot of monetization is tied to reimbursement from the state and from at the national level. And so especially with B2B apps, right? And I think with B2C, obviously there are lots of things that are similar to other sort of consumer apps where, you understand willingness to pay, you understand value to cost, and based on that, you kind of determine your monetization structure. Specifically with ratings, I think, healthcare ratings are important for any app, I think upfront. But I think it's important to understand like how you weed out noise with ratings and how you kind of be really clear in your language that, for example, these apps are prescription only versus, available to the general public. So I think that's another way to kind of be cognizant of how you position your app in the app store and in front of users.
Right. Thank you so much, Anu. I think we are running short of time. And Shama, do you have anything to say?
I think you're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry for that. Yeah. So I just wanted to thank the audience for the enthusiasm participation. And due to time constraints, we could take only a few questions, but we intend on answering them all. So please scan the QR code for an elaborate one-on-one discussion with our career counselor and to learn more about the product management program offered by the Institute. And thank you, Anu, for that amazing Q&A session. It was really brilliant and very insightful.